program for the next thought-provoking session. For that, we have with us Professor Prashant Mishra. I feel honored to introduce Professor Prashant Mishra. Professor Mishra is a professor and head in Department of English, Government SVPG College, Neemuch, MP, India. He did his master's in English and doctorate in criticism on John Keats as a critic. His theory and practice from Vikram University, Ujjain, MP. He also had his education at CPhil Hyderabad, from where he did PGCT, PGDT, and MPhil in linguistics and phonetics. His major area of interest include linguistics, criticism, postmodern theories, and pedagogical issues. Dr. Mishra published many research papers and articles in scholarly journals and anthologies. He authored 4 books and edited 10 anthologies on ELT, criticism, and literature. He participated in many national and international seminars organized by different institutions and academic bodies in India, and also acted as a resource person in some of them. He translated MP People's Linguistic Survey of India, published by Orient Longman. He reviewed papers for Sky Journal of Linguistics, Finland, and 3L Journal of Language, Literature, and Linguistics by National University of Delhi. Dr. Mishra was also felicitated on 5th September 2013 at Sahitya Academy, Delhi, for translating the People's Linguistic Survey of India, Madhya Pradesh volume into English. Dr. Mishra is going to deliver an insightful and interesting lecture, and I'm sure that it will serve as a fillip to many budding researchers and faculty members. So I'll welcome Prashant Mishra sir to come and deliver his lecture. Over to you, sir. Unmute your mic, sir, please.
You need to unmute yourself, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Honorable Professor Suman Pamecha ma'am, the office bearers of Rajasthan Association of English Studies, Professor Sunil Bhargav sir, Dr. Rajul ma'am, the convener of this 7-day contemporary critical theory program, Dr. Hemant Chandalia ji and Dr. Rashri Ranawat ma'am, my guru, my teacher, respected Dr. Z.N. Patil sir, and all the dear participants. So I begin my lecture by showing my regards to my respected teacher, Dr. Patil sir. So this is my introduction. Manoj ji missed it, but now I will add that Dr. Patil sir took me to pragmatics, stylistics, and he taught me the nitty-gritties of structuralism, post-structuralism, introduced me to different theories. I
It will be
also
very interesting
congratulate
to hear
Rase.
after the teacher, the student. It will be interesting to hear after the teacher, the student.
Yeah. So I also congratulate Rase for organizing this training program. Rase has already groomed so many scholars, and Rase has successfully organized so many conferences, so many training programs. So I congratulate respected Chandalia ji for organizing so many programs for our young scholars. And he told me that he wanted that our young scholars and young professors who are not familiar with the fundamentals of critical theory, for them it is better if we organize a short-term program. So congratulations to you, sir. And I hope in future also Rase will continue to organize such type of programs to benefit and groom our young scholars. So we have a very mesmerizing lecture by Professor Z.N. Patil, sir. And now I am going to talk about some fundamentals, some nitty-gritties of structuralism and post-structuralism. We know that structuralism is a culmination of the new criticism, Russian formalism, and it is a part of linguistic theory. It is the application of linguistics in the appreciation of literature. So, structuralism came into existence with the publication of Saussure's book, A Course in General Linguistics, in 1916. In this book, Saussure talks about some basic concepts. He gave the concept of signifier and signified. He also gave the concept of langue and parole, and the concepts of synchronic and diachronic linguistics, the concept of syntagmatic and paradigmatic relationships. We know that before the publication of this book, most of the linguistic studies were philological. They were diachronic in nature. They have tried to study languages on the historical principles, and the effort was to compare different languages over a period of time to trace similarities and dissimilarities between them in order to evolve language groups or language families. But Saussure looked at signification from the synchronic point of view. We are not concerned with the evolutionary stages of languages or the evolutionary stages of text. We are concerned with the present state of language. So language is regarded by Saussure as something existing in the present point of time. So we are concerned with the interpretation of a text at the present point of time, not over a period of time. So synchronic interpretation of a text, this is undertaken by Saussure. Now Saussure's concept of signifier and signified. The main aim, as Professor Chandalia ji says, in literary criticism is the signification of a text or exploring the meaning of a text. Now, in structuralism as well as in post-structuralism, we come across two different aspects of meaning. Whereas for structuralism, meaning is fixed, meaning is something absolute, meaning is something transcendental. For post-structuralism, meaning is something dynamic, meaning is open-ended, meaning is to be challenged. It is not transcendental. It is not transcendental. So as far as structuralism is concerned, Saussure sees that a sign consists of a relationship between a signifier and a signifier. And this relationship between a signifier and a signifier, according to Saussure, is arbitrary relationship. By arbitrary relationship, we mean that there is no logical relationship between science and the concepts or the ideas with which they are associated. We don't have a rational explanation. Why a four-legged animal dog? Why a four-legged animal dog is called dog? Why do we call it dog? Why do we call another four-legged animal as cat? Why do we call another animal as cow? We don't have a rational explanation. So Saussure says that this relationship between signifier and signified, it is a arbitrary relationship because this relationship is psychological. It exists in our mind. We have associated a particular concept, a particular image with a particular sign in our mind. So whenever we listen to dog, then a particular image, a particular idea is evoked in our mind. And we associate this sign or this signifier with a particular signified or with a particular concept or with a particular idea. So this relationship is arbitrary and this relationship is psychological. Now, if the signs are arbitrary, then the problem comes, how do we identify the signs? Now, Saussure tries to answer this question. He says that we identify the signs with the help of their differential relationship. The signs occur in a contrastive, in a differential, in a oppositional relationship. We call a particular animal dog. because this animal is not a cat or this animal is not a cow. Just as in phonetics, we identify phonemes with the help of contrastive distribution, with the help of their contrast in minimal pair of words. For example, if we have to identify two sounds, pa and ta, then we try to identify them in a contrastive relationship, pin and tin. So by occurring in a contrastive relationship, pa and ta, these two signs have different meaning. So we identify them. Similarly, with differential relationship, we identify the meaning of words. We identify the signification of words because different words, according to Saussure, occur in oppositional or contrastive relationship. So we identify words with their absences, not with presence. A dog is dog because it is not a cat. So this is differential relationship. We identify the meaning of words through their contrast or through their occurrence in a binary relationship. In a binary relationship. In structuralism, we talk about the binary relationship. And then we also identify the meaning of words when they occur in a syntagmatic relationship. Their relationship is important. So here Saussure talks about two types of relationship. One is the paradigmatic relationship and second is the syntagmatic relationship. The paradigmatic relationship is concerned with a number of choices. In human languages, we have so many choices. Choices at the level of sounds, choices at the level of lexis or words, and choices at the level of syntax. So we have different types of choices and we have to make selection. We have to make selection out of these choices. And then we have to put these choices in a particular relationship according to the rule of co-occurrence possibility. Different lexical items, they co-occur. They co-occur or they occur together. Their occurrence is governed by certain rules, certain conventions, etc. So when different choices occur in relation, in a syntagmatic relationship, then they convey their meaning. So meaning is conveyed through their differences and through their occurrence in a relationship. And I have already told you that we are concerned with the synchronic meaning. We are concerned with the present state of words or the present meaning of words. Present meaning of words. So as far as signification for Saussure is concerned, the relationship between the signifier and the signified, it is arbitrary, it is psychological, and this signification takes place in a relation, and we come to know the meaning through binary opposition. And finally, the most important concept given by Saussure is the concept of langue and parole. If we are concerned with the underlying recurring patterns, the underlying system of human language. It is the underlying system that contributes to the meaning. The individual speech or the individual utterances, the individual sentences spoken by us constitute the parole. So paroles are infinite in number. They are infinite in number. And each and every day we are speaking new sentences. Whenever we speak, we come out with new sentences, new utterances. But our paroles, they are in one way or the other related to the law or the underlying system. So it is the underlying system that provides meaning to our parole. That provides meaning to the parole. Similarly, there are so many texts in literature. We have so many individual texts. So just as we have to discover the grammar of speech or the grammar of our language. Similarly, we have to discover the grammar of literature. So these individual texts, they have to be related to the langue or to the grammar of literature. That is one aim of structural criticism. That is one aim of structural criticism. So in structural criticism, we try to analyze the individual text. We try to relate the individual text to the lung or to the broader system of rules. And we study this text synchronically. We study these texts synchronically. Now, this concept of Sasyo, that science consists of signifier and signified. Later on, this concept was improved by so many other people, so many other critics. We know Barthes, Roland Barthes. He is a structuralist as well as he is also a post-structuralist. So the earlier works of Barthes, particularly mythology, that is structuralist in nature, and the later works of Barthes, they are post-structuralist in nature. Now in mythology, Barthes improved this concept of signifier and signifier. Barthes says, Barthes agrees with Saussure that a sign consists of a signifier and a signifier. But where Barthes deviates from Saussure is that, according to Barthes, Saussure's concept of sign, the relationship between the signifier and the signifier, it refers to only first level of signification. When we associate dog, this signifier, with a particular four-legged animal, which becomes a signified for us. Now this four-legged animal dog, for Barthes, it becomes a signifier. And to this signifier, we associate another meaning, the meaning of faithfulness, the meaning of faithfulness. So we create different types of myths by taking the semiological meaning of the first level to the second level. Barthes gave the example of a photograph from a Persian magazine. And in this photograph, a French soldier is seen as saluting the French flag, looking upward. Now, this photograph, it refers to only first level of signification. The French soldier saluting the French flag. Now, this is the first level of signification. A particular sign is associated with a particular photograph. Now, when this photograph is taken as a signifier for the second level, and we associate another meaning with it, that is the inclusive French culture or patriotism, then we have created a myth. We have created a myth. So generally, we create myths by associating so many ideological, so many rhetorical, and so many different types of meanings. So many things, for example, in the colonial times, the imperialism, the colonial exploitation, etc., killings, etc. Now, they have been associated with democracy. Now, they have been associated with different other humanistic concepts or meanings. So, myths are created. So, Barthes studies the French culture, the French bourgeois culture, the French bourgeois. They have created different types of myths and so many things they have converted as if they are natural, as if they are natural. So Barthes talks about myths. Then further, Barthes talks about the fashion system. Barthes says that the fashion system is also created on the line of myths by taking the first level meaning to the second level meaning, by taking the first level signified to the second level meaning by associating another meaning to it. And fashion system, according to Barthes, works on the structure, works on the structure, works on the pattern, works on the grammar of language. Just as a sentence consists of subject plus verb plus object. Similarly, Barthes says that this fashion matrix or this fashion structure, it consists of the object of signification, it consists of the support of signification, and it consists of the variant of signification, object of signification plus variant of signification plus support of signification. When we say when we take an example and when we say that skirts with a full blouse, skirts with a full blouse. Now skirts, this is the object of signification, and blouse, this is the support of signification. Now we have a variant that is full. Full is the variant. Skirts with a full blouse. Now we can change this variant. We can say skirts with half blouse. We know that the fashion industry keeps on changing. Sometimes we have a full blouse, sometimes we have a half blouse, sometimes we have a narrow trouser, sometimes we have a long bottom, etc. and etc. So these variants keep on changing. We can change the variant. We can also change the object of signification. We can also change the subject of signification. Instead of blouse, we can add some other thing. It may be a shirt, it may be a shirt, it may be a sweater, it may be something else. So we can change the slots. So these are the slots. So just as we have slots and we have so many choices, similarly in fashion system also, we change the variants, we change the choices, and by changing the choices, we try to create different types of myths. We try to attract our customers. We try to attract our customers. So fashion system, according to Barth, works on the matrix of structure. We have the structure of language. Similarly, we have the structure of the fashion system. We have so many choices, and we can use these choices to fill the slot of the variant, to change the fashion, to change the fashion. So for Barth, the rhetorical code, the ideology, they becomes important in the assignment of meaning, in the assignment of meaning. So when ideologies enter into the assignment of meaning, then they take the first level of signification to the second level of signification. Now after Barth, Roman Jakobson, he gave the concept of function. He gave the concept of function. As far as Saussure was concerned, Saussure was confined only to the formal aspect of signification. Saussure was confined only to the formal aspect of signification. And Roman Jakobson, he took his study from the formal aspect to the functional aspect. Roman Jakobson talks about 6 different facilitators of communication, and these 6 different facilitators of communication he connected or he related with different functions. These 6 facilitators of communication, according to Jakobson, are: number 1, the addresser and the addressee. For a communication, we need both the addresser and the addressee, and the message takes place in a context. So second important thing is context, because message never occur in a vacuum. Message takes place in a context, and message has to be encoded. So another important thing is code or language. So we have to encode the message, and the message takes place in a context. And then we also need a channel. This channel is called contact, and a contact is established between the speaker and the listener, or between the addresser and the addressee. So addresser and the addressee, the context of the utterance, the message, the code in which the message is encoded, and the contact are the channel. Now these 6 facilitators of verbal communication, they contribute to the 6 different functions. And Jakobson studies the communication process, or literary process, or signification process from the point of view of these 6 functions. According to him, the first function that is very important is the referential function. This referential function is related to the information that takes place in a context, so the information that takes place in a context is the referential function. But we know that the communication depends upon the addresser and the addressee. The emotions of the addresser are very important. So when the emotions of the addresser are studied, then we talk about the emotive function. When we study the effect of the message on the addressee, then we talk about the conative function. And we also know that sometimes when we have to initiate a discussion, when we have to initiate a conversation, then we use some ceremonial phrases. We use good morning, good afternoon, how are you? So we use such type of ritualistic phrases or ceremonial phrases. So this is called the phatic function. And the linguistic function, that is called the metalingual function. But another function that is significant for us is the poetic function. Language also performs the poetic function. We use language in a special manner. Sometimes we have to foreground something. So in order to foreground a particular content, a particular part, we use poetic function. For example, the language of poetry is different from the common everyday conversational language. The language of poetry is highly foregrounding language. In poetry, we have to create a foregrounding effect, and we use so many highlighting devices. For example, if we take few lines from I Tasted Liquor Never Brewed. Now in this poem, Emily Dickinson says, inebriate of air am I, debauchee of dew, reeling through endless summer days. Now the poetess is saying that she is inebriate of air. The simple sentence is, I am inebriate of air. But here the syntax, the syntagmatic relationship, that is changed. Inebriate of air am I. The poetess is talking about inebriation. She is talking about intoxication because she is intoxicant of the beauties of nature. She is talking about her sensual enjoyment in the beauties of nature. And therefore, those words which are associated with intoxication, inebriate, reeling, debauchee, all these words are put into the front. So this is the poetic function of language. So we use language in a particular foregrounded manner, highlighting manner. In order to highlight, we change our choices. So selection and combination. Roman Jacobson talks about the selection and combination. Selection is concerned with paradigmatic choice, and combination is concerned with the syntagmatic choice. So in poetic function, we use our choices in a particular manner. Poets enjoy the licenses. They break the normal word order in order to highlight a particular content, in order to highlight a particular theme of their poem. For example, in another example, when Wordsworth says, 10,000 saw I at a glance. The simple sentence is, I saw 10,000 at a glance. But Wordsworth is talking about the amazing treasure house of daffodils, and therefore he has put 10,000 into the front, and he has also exaggerated. So through the use of hyperbole and by using 10,000 in the front, the poet is able to attract, he is successful in attracting the attention of the reader towards this particular treasure house of nature. So this is the poetic function, and this function depends upon our mental ability of selection and organization. So Jacobson talks about these 6 functions. Then after Jacobson, A.J. Grimas. He took the formal discussion to the semantic level. He took the formal discussion to the semantic level, and he talked about 3 units of a discourse. One is the seam, second is the classeme, and third is the anaphora. Third is the anaphora. Now, seam, the minimal meaning unit or the semantic unit is called a seam. So the minimal semantic unit is called a seam. But only seams are not sufficient because meaning always takes place in a context. So when we talk about the contextual seams or the occurrence of seams in a context, so these contextual seams, they are called classeme. They are called classeme. And later on, anaphors means relating the different parts of our discourse through different cohesive devices. Anaphors are those devices which refer to the backward or the previous utterances, and cataphors are those devices which refer to the forward utterances or later on utterances. So this includes cohesion. Respected Patil sir talked about, or he answered about cohesion and coherence. So seam, the basic or the minimal unit, and the occurrence of seams in a context, that is classeme, and the arrangement of seams into a cohesive whole, or the arrangement of different utterances, sentences into a cohesive whole to construct a discourse or a talk. That is very important. So A.J. Grimas talks about seams, classemes, and anaphors. And A.J. Grimas, he built his grammar of discourse on the basis of Chomskyan grammar, or on the basis of Saussure's Long and Perot. His grammar is generative. His grammar is generative. He talks about actants and actor. Actants are like the deep levels, and actors are like the surface level. Actants are like the deep level. Just as we have deep level sentences, at the deep level we have rules. We have the grammatical system. Through continuous exposure to a language, the deep level rules, they become inbuilt in our mind. So we acquire a competence in our language. So actants are like the deep levels, and actors are like the surface level. Now, in his narrative grammar, the actants are classified on 3 axes. The first axis is the axis of desire, that includes the subject and object. The subject is like the agent, and object is something that is sought, by the subject. For example, the king banished a person from his kingdom. Now the king is the subject, and the person that is banished is the object. So this is the axis of desire, that includes subject and object. Second is the axis of power, that includes the helper, a person who supports the subject, in seeking or in fulfilling his aim. That is the supporter, or he is the helper. And there may be a person who may be an opponent, who will try to put a hurdle or an obstacle in the course of action chosen by the subject. So he is the opponent. So helper, the person who helps the king. If somebody has helped the king, he may be a soldier. So if a soldier has helped the king in banishing some person from the kingdom, then he is the helper. So if a prince loves a princess, then prince is the subject, the princess is the object. The person who supports them, he is the supporter, or he is the helper. But the person who puts an obstacle, it may be a villain, the villain who puts an obstacle or who comes in between their love. So he is the hindrance, or he is the opponent. And then the third axis is the axis of transmission. And this axis includes the sender and the receiver. So the sender is the person who initiates the action, the king who initiates the action, or any person who initiates the action. He may be a sender. And then we have a receiver. Now the receiver is one who is benefited by the action, the person who is benefited by the action. So the prince is able to marry the princess. So the princess is the benefiter. She is benefited by the action. So she is the receiver. She is the receiver. So Grimus talks about three axes. The first axis is the axis of desire that includes subject and object. The second axis is the axis of power that includes helper and the opponent. And the third axis is the axis of transmission that includes sender and receiver. So in this way, Grimus tries to build her semantic grammar. Semantic grammar. Now after Grimus, then we know that Todorov, who was a Russian linguist, he also talked about the generative aspect of grammar. He also recognized the grammar at the two levels, deep level and surface level, just as Grimus talks about the actants and the actors. The actors are at the surface level. The actor may be a king, maybe a prince, maybe a person who is benefited, maybe a person who initiates the action, etc. and etc. Now, Todorov gave the example of genre, and he says that all the species of literature, whether comedy or whether tragedy, they are related to some genre. So a text is always related to a genre. And when we read a text with the help of genre, we are able to imagine or we are able to understand the meaning of a text. So we understand the meaning of a text with the help of the genre to which it belongs. Then second thing Todorov says is that second thing, Todorov says that as far as poetics is concerned, the individual text have to be interpreted with respect to the broader perspectives or with respect to the long, with respect to long. And Todorov says that in order to understand individual text, we have to understand or we must know the underlying grammar or the underlying system of rules. Now, finally, the concept of signifier and signified given by Saussure. It is further improved by Peirce. Peirce talked about the triadic relationship between the signifier and the signified. Saussure only talks about the dyadic relationship. According to Saussure, a sign consists of only signifier and the signified. Now, as far as Peirce is concerned, he says that a sign consists of a signifier, a signified object, and an interpretant. Signifier means, for example, dog is the signifier. Signified means the object of signification, the four-legged animal, the concept or the idea that is associated with a signifier. And third is the effect of the signifier and the signified on the hearer or on the person. So when a hearer listens a sign, then this sign evokes an image or it provides an effect on the hearer. So this effect of the sign on the interpretant or on the hearer, this is also important in the signification process. And Peer says that not all the characteristics of a signifier are important for signification. Similarly, not all the characteristics of an object or signified are important for signification. Only few characteristics of signifier, they are important for signification, and only few characteristics of signified, they are important for signification. So Peirce calls these characteristics as sign vehicles and object vehicles. So sign vehicles, the important characteristics of signifier, and object vehicles, the important characteristics of signifiers. They contribute to signification, and together they have an effect on the hearer. So this effect of the hearer, that is also important. So Peirce took this debate of signifier and signified to the level of the hearer, or what is the effect of this relationship of signifier and signified on a hearer. So only when there is an effect, only when this relationship evokes an image in the mind of the hearer, when the image of a dog is evoked in the mind of the hearer, then only the hearer will be able to understand what a four-legged animal dog is. So in structuralism, Saussure initiated the debate on the relationship between signifier and signified. He looked at this relationship from the synchronic point of view, from the differential point of view, from the relational point of view, and finally from the point of view of law. So we can signify an utterance or a sign, or we can understand a text. We can understand a text, or we can understand the meaning of text only when we read a text in relation to the law, or in relation to the underlying grammar, in relation to the system from where this text is produced. So we have to read different text in relation to the law or in relation to the grammar of literature. And we are concerned with the synchronic or the meaning of text at a point of time, or particularly the present meaning of a text, because we are not concerned with the evolutionary state of the meaning of a text. We are concerned with the present text. So this is about structuralism. Now, as far as structuralism is concerned, structuralism talks about recurring patterns, particular patterns. We are concerned in discovering the particular patterns. We are concerned in discovering the main pattern. So the main meaning, the main pattern becomes important. Our aim is to discover the core meanings, core rules, core patterns, main rules, etc. So that with the help of core rules or with the help of law, we will be able to find out, or we will be able to explain the meaning of the individual text. So in structuralism, there is emphasis on the core, on the main. And as far as structuralism is concerned, since main or the core is important, so this main or the core, it provides permanent meaning. It provides permanent meaning. It leads a text to transcendental status, to the transcendental status. With the publication of Derrida's paper in 1966, we know that in 1966, Derrida presented his paper. The title of the paper is Structure, Sign and Play in the Human Sciences. Structure, Science and Play in the Human Sciences. And this presentation of the paper, Structure, Sign and Play in the Human Sciences, at the conference held at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. It paved the way for post-structuralist criticism or deconstructive criticism. This is a declaration of the statement of deconstruction or post-structuralism in literature. Now, as far as Derrida is concerned, Derrida says that the structuralist attempts to confine the meaning to the main, to the recurring patterns, to the long. It takes the signification process to the transcendental status. To the transcendental status. We know that earlier in Christian theology, in Hebrew, they talk about logos. They talk about logos. Logos means the word of God, or the revelation of God's word, or revelation of truth to man. So different texts, they are assigned transcendental status in structuralism, because in structuralism we are concerned with the main, we are concerned with the core, we are concerned with the absolute meanings. Studying the main patterns or studying the core leads to the absolute meaning. So now structuralism, the meaning is closed-ended. For structuralism, the meaning is closed-ended. But as far as Derrida is concerned, Derrida says that as far as human languages are concerned, as far as signification is concerned, signification is always deferred endlessly. Derrida agrees with Saussure on the differential nature of signifier. We come to know the meaning of words when they occur in a differential relationship, in a contrastive relationship. But Derrida says that as far as meanings of signifiers are concerned, meanings of text are concerned, meanings are deferred endlessly. Meanings are deferred endlessly. We cannot close the meaning of a text. We cannot close the meaning of text. So Derrida recognized the deferral nature of signifiers. He recognized the deferral nature of signifiers. Now, Derrida says that as far as signifiers are concerned, there is always a competition among signifiers to fill up the trace. When we study text, then in a text, no signifier is able to provide a final meaning. Signifiers only leaves traces. They leave traces. When we put different words in a slot, then in a slot, there are so many words which we can use. And all these words, they compete among themselves. They try to prove among themselves that they are the better candidate. They are the better candidate for filling this slot. There is a competition among the words. So Derrida gave the concept of trace, that we never arrive at the final meaning of a text. Instead of arriving final meaning, we only arrive at a trace. And different signifiers, they compete among themselves to fill up this trace. And Derrida gave the concept of eraser. Derrida gave the concept of eraser. As soon as a signifier is filled into a trace, at the same time it is also erased. So a signifier is used under eraser. Under eraser. So there is only substitution of meaning. There is only supplementation of meaning. There are so many substitutes who contend, who fight to fill up this trace. There is a conflict among different signifiers. And this conflict among different signifiers saves the text from reaching a transcendental meaning, or from reaching a absolute meaning, or from reaching only one meaning. It opens up a text. It opens up a text. So Derrida's concept of trace, Derrida's concept of eraser, and Derrida's concept of supplementation. So all these concepts are given by Derrida in this paper. So according to Derrida, a text is always open-ended. A text is never closed-ended. As far as structuralism is concerned, structuralism, by assigning transcendental meaning or transcendental signification to signifiers, closes a text from further interpretation. The aim of structuralism was to find out or discover the core or the main structures. And these main structures, they keep the signification of a text stable, absolute, final, and closed. But Derrida believes that As far as a text is concerned, a text only leaves traces for further substitutes, which can be filled in these blanks or traces to provide new meaning, to provide new meaning. So there is infinity of signification. Signification is an endless process. Then Derrida also recognized that all the texts, they are born out of context. And in all the texts, there is a metaphorical element. There is also an intertextual element. So the contextual element, the metaphorical element, and the intertextual element, they lead the signification process to infinity. They lead the signification process to infinity. Because not only signifiers are infinite, but Derrida says that even context is also boundless. Context is also infinite. So signifiers are infinite for Derrida, context is also infinite, and there is intertextual element. The present text, its relationship to the past text, past utterances, etc., and its relationship to the future text, etc., and the different historical, psychological, philosophical, different elements in a text makes the signification process dynamic, mobile, in a flux, in a flux. Now, after Derrida, we know that Roland Barthes, he talks about readerly text and writerly text. And this concept of writerly text, particularly its concept of writerly text, is a contribution to post-structuralism. As far as structuralism is concerned, structuralism closes the signification process. But as far as post-structuralism is concerned, Derrida and Barthes also attended that famous conference on post-structuralism in Johns Hopkins University, and he was inspired by Derrida. And he gave the concept of readerly text and writerly text. According to him, the readerly text is a closed-ended text, and a writerly text is an open-ended text. There are some texts which are classical in nature, which are written according to set rules. So these texts, where there is no scope for multiple signification, multiple meaning, they are readerly text. But there are so many texts in which there is a scope for multiple interpretation. The texts which are open-ended, where the signification is deferred endlessly, those texts are writerly text. Derrida says that when a text is written, the author is dead. By the death of the author, Barthes says when a text is born, the author is dead. So by the death of the author, Barthes means that the text is open for multiple interpretation. The text is open for multiple interpretation. Now the text is in the hands of the reader, and through different interpretations, the readers, they rewrite a text. They rewrite a text. So as far as readerly text is concerned, that is the consumer of meaning. In a readerly text, the reader, they only consume the meaning. That is like a commodity. That is like a work. Barthes also talks about work and text. So that is like a work. But as far as the writerly text is concerned, here the reader becomes the producer of meaning. He becomes a co-writer in producing meaning. So this concept of writerly text, it is contribution to post-structuralism. Now, after Barthes, when we read Mikhail Bakhtin, he gave the concept of dialogism. And this dialogism, it is another contribution to post-structuralism. Bakhtin differentiates between monologic text and dialogic text. The monologic texts are governed by only single voice, whereas dialogic texts are governed by different voices. They are governed by different voices. They are like dialogue. Bakhtin says that epics are the specimens of monologic text, because in epics there is a voice of God, and the signification is closed-ended. The signification is closed-ended. We provide theological, canonical, and transcendental signification to epical text. But as far as novels are concerned, as far as dramas are concerned, they are dialogic because there is a presence of different characters. There is a presence of different voices, and the presence of different characters, different voices contributes to dialogism, contributes to dialogism. So these dialogic texts, they are marked by polyphony, they are marked by polyphony, they are marked by heteroglossia. They may
So, I'm so sorry to interpret. I'm so sorry to disturb you, sir. But there are a lot of questions also. So, if you could conclude, sir.
Okay. So I
No,
shall.
sir, there are a lot of questions in the chat box.
Okay, with your permission, I shall conclude.
You can conclude. I'm so sorry to disturb you, sir.
No,
It was such an interesting and engaging talk, sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for reminding me about my time.
No, 8 o'clock, no, actually, sir.
Thank you. So the dialogic text, that is also open to multiple interpretation. So Bakhtin's concept of monologic text and dialogic text. Then we know that Julia Kristeva, she talks about the entry of subject into the interpretation of the meaning of a text. She says that there are two types of text. One is the phenotext and second is the genotext. The phenotext, that is characterized by the symbolic mode, and as far as genotext is concerned, it is characterized by the semiotic mode. Kristeva says that our communication is characterized by semiotic mode, means when it is governed by our emotions, sentiments, which are marked by rhythm, which are marked by intonation. So this is the semiotic mode. And when we use a language in a formal manner, then we use the symbolic mode. So signification includes both the symbolic mode and the semiotic mode, both the phenotext and the genotext. It includes the grammar as well as the emotions of the speaker. So this entry of the subject into the discussion makes the signification process open-ended, makes the signification process open-ended. So as far as post-structuralism is concerned, the post-structuralism liberates a text from closed-ended reading, from absolute signification, from assigning transcendental signification to signifier, and opens a text for multiple interpretations, So when we read a text or when we deconstruct a text, our effort is to find out the multiple layers of meaning, So thematically as well as linguistically, we can analyze the text. So thematically, we can try to find out the contextual elements, the metaphorical elements, the intertextual elements, and different contradictory, paradoxical elements in a text, which leads to multiple signification. And linguistically, we have to find out some linguistic devices. What are the linguistic devices which contributes to the multiple interpretations of a text? So this is the post-structuralist strategy. The structuralist strategy is to find out the core, the main structures, the underlying system, to discover the long, so that with the help of the long or the underlying structure, we will be able to explain the individual text, because we regard that the individual text are the parts of the underlying structure. But in post-structuralism, our reading is to find out the contradictory elements in a text, paradoxical elements in a text, intertextual elements in a text. The tropes are the metaphorical elements, because often the tropes are the metaphorical elements. They are affixed, they are appended on a text, and they create a conflict between the pure language and the appended metaphorical language. And this conflict between the pure language and the appended metaphorical language contributes to infinity of meaning. So this is the post-structuralist strategy. So, okay, I thank the organizer for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, and I apologize, sir. I apologize.
No, no, no.
But actually, there are a lot of questions for you, Manoj, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. It was an insightful lecture. Thank you for bestowing on us such a wonderful experience. You have flooded us with a lot of information, and I'm sure that young scholars can take this or their doctoral and postdoctoral research. Now I'll request Rashri ma'am to take 1 or 2 questions. I think we can take 1 or 2 questions and then conclude with a word of thanks. Rashri ma'am, over to you.
Okay. So there's one question from Khushbu Bhati. Was structuralism reliable?
I say that all the theories are reliable. All the theories are reliable, and all the theories, they have their strength, they have their some weaknesses.
Strength and weakness both.
Yeah. So it depends on us. It depends on our learning, our skill as a critic, how to apply a particular theory, whether it is structuralism, whether it is post-structuralism, whether it is pragmatics on a particular text. So it is reliable.
Depends upon
Linguistics contributed a lot to criticism.
So Nayab says structuralism gives importance to language and philosophy rather than history or author. What about post-structuralism?
Yeah. So as far as post-structuralism is concerned, I have just told you that structuralism is concerned with the core, with the main structures, etc. Now post-structuralism, it is concerned with trying to discover the multiplicities, the multiple significations, try to dismantle a text to find out the contradictory elements, paradoxical elements, the figurative elements, the intertextual elements, which are contributing to the multiple signification, which are opening a text for multiple signification. There are so many texts, particularly when we read different romantic writers, Keats, etc. When we read Keats's Ode on a Nightingale. Now in Ode on a Nightingale, we see the wavering mind of the Keats. Keats wishes to escape from the hard realities of life, from the fevers, miseries, etc. And he engages in a number of surmises, in a number of guesses, that I would try to leave this world by drinking wine or by drinking opiate, etc., or by flying on the wings of poesy, etc., and etc. And he ends the poem on a note of uncertainty, and by saying, was it a vision or prophecy? Do I wake or sleep? So the poem ends on a note of uncertainty. So trying to find out uncertainty, undecidability. So this is another important feature of post-structuralism. So we have to find out the undecidability. When there is a conflict between different signifiers to fill a slot, they reach a point of undecidability or impasse, where we are not able to decide whether this signifier may be substituted or whether that signifier may be substituted.
Perhaps the last question of the session. What is logocentrism in Derrida's perception?
Okay. So as far as logocentrism is concerned, I told you that logos means the word of God, or God's revelation of truth to man. Now, as far as Derrida is concerned, Derrida is against assigning any logocentric signification to signifiers. According to Derrida, the text should not be logocentric. If a text is logocentric, then this text is closed. Then you cannot challenge. Then it won't be open for signification. Because if we assign theological meaning to text, as we do in religious text, so the religious texts, they are transcendental. So if you challenge them, then there will be a danger to your life. There will be a danger to your life. So Derrida is against this logocentric concept. According to him, this logocentric concept is a phonocentric concept, because when we say that words are assigned transcendental significance, now words constitute our speech, and in traditional criticism, in traditional linguistics, speech is given priority over writing. So Derrida says that this logocentrism, which is regarded as a phonocentrism, now this is not a good concept. This is not a good concept. He gave the concept of arch writing. According to him, there should be graphocentrism, or the emphasis should be on writing rather than speech. So his concept of arch writing, his concept of grammatology includes deferment of signification. It includes trace, it includes eraser, etc. and etc.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for so patiently